You were never meant to hear this, and if you stay, you will carry a weight that can never be lifted, because what I am about to reveal was sealed away, buried under generations of silence, in a place where secrets rot the soil and bleed into the bones of every descendant who walks the land. The Ellison family of Alabama thought they had buried their shame in the year 1850. But silence does not erase truth. It only delays the awakening. The house they built stood on land that was older than maps, older than records, and older than the very state that claimed to rule it. The soil itself remembered things long before their first brick was laid, but the Ellisons believed in bloodline in control, in lineage, preserved at any cost. They were proud, and they were rich. Yet they lived in fear of one thing, the 16th birthday of every daughter. From the outside, the Ellisons seemed respectable. A Southern family of good standing with property influence and a strict matriarchal code. But no visitor stayed long enough to notice the rules, the strange rituals. The way the house went quiet whenever a girl approached her 16th year. Whispers in the town spread. But no one spoke too loudly, not when the family had power, not when the sheriff was in their debt, not when the church turned its head. Still, the rumors twisted through the community like smoke. Some claimed the daughters were sent away for education. Others said illness took them one by one. But those who lived near the estate knew better. They spoke of strange lights flickering in the windows of shadows, pacing the grounds of muffled screams that cut through the night, and then silence. Absolute silence, as if the walls themselves swallowed sound. Every daughter vanished on her 16th birthday, without explanation, without burial, without goodbye, and each time the family closed ranks dressed in black and carried on as if nothing had been lost, as if daughters were sacrifices, not children, as if silence was safer than truth. The people of Alabama whispered about curses, about old deals struck in blood. But the Ellisons never answered. They only watched and waited for the next birthday to arrive. And so, the story begins not with life, but with absence. Not with joy, but with the silence of vanished daughters, and the heavy truth that behind every locked door there waits a history written in fear, To understand the Ellison curse, you must first understand the matriarch, because the power of the family was never in the men who owned the land or the papers that proved inheritance. It was in the women who ruled from the shadows, especially one woman, the grandmother who set the law in silence. She was known only as Mother Ellison, never by a first name, never by a softer word. Her voice commanded her sons, her husband, her church, and her community without ever raising above a whisper. It was Mother Ellison who first declared the rule. We do not speak of the daughters on their 16th birthday. We do not ask. We do not remember. We move forward as though nothing occurred. Her word was not suggestion. It was decree, and even men twice her size bowed under the weight of her stare, because she carried something more frightening than anger. She carried certainty, the certainty of a secret larger than all of them. The daughters were raised like flowers in glass cases, protected, cherished, dressed in finery, taught music, scripture, manners, and the arts. They were praised as the crown of the family until the day they neared the edge of 16. Then everything changed. Meals became stricter. Conversation became cold. The laughter in the halls dimmed, and shadows seemed to grow longer inside the house. The girls whispered to each other, and to the servants who dared listen, that they feared the day they would be led down to the locked cellar beneath the east wing. A place no guest had ever seen, a place sealed with iron. Mother Ellison told her sons that bloodlines are preserved through sacrifice, that power comes not from wealth alone, but from obedience to the old laws, older than the state, older than the church. She told them that silence protects power, And forgetting is safer than memory. The men obeyed because they feared losing the inheritance. But deeper still, they feared losing her favor. Neighbors swore. They saw black carriages arrive on nights when a daughter vanished. Carriages with no lanterns. No driver visible, pulled by horses that made no sound as they struck the dirt road. The air grew colder when they passed, and animals refused to follow them. Said the girls were taken away alive. Others swore they were never seen again, because they were not meant to be, they were offerings. The townsfolk turned their eyes away, because those who asked too many questions were shunned or ruined. Some lost their farms. Some vanished themselves, until fear sealed every mouth. The silence of the Ellison family became the silence of the whole community, and the land swallowed the truth with every generation. The Ellison estate stood like a monument to secrets. The brick walls were heavy, the windows tall and narrow, like watching eyes. The halls smelled of old wood and candle wax, and every step echoed too loudly, as though the house itself listened. Servants moved carefully, never too quickly, never too loud, their faces pale, their voices hushed, because the walls were said to repeat what they heard at night. Every daughter was told the same story when she was young, that she was chosen by God to carry the family's legacy, that her bloodline was different from all others, that she would serve a purpose too sacred to be spoken aloud. At first, the girls believed the praise, but as they aged, they felt the weight of it shift. They noticed how no woman over 16 remained in the family. No older sisters, no cousins, no aunts. Only men, and a single matriarch who seemed untouched by time. The 16th birthday approached like a storm. Each candle on the cake felt like a countdown, not a celebration. Neighbors whispered that they heard faint music from the house on those nights, low chanting like hymns, twisted into something darker. Then silence, then screams muffled, too quickly to be carried by the wind. The next day the house would open its doors, as though nothing happened. The men walking with forced calm, Mother Ellison standing with serene eyes, and the portrait of the missing girl removed from the wall, as though she had never been born. Some claimed that beneath the estate tunnels ran into the earth, leading to chambers carved out by hands, long before the Ellisons ever came to Alabama. Strange symbols were etched into the stone walls, and black wax from candles burned into the rock. The servants who once spoke of these places vanished within weeks, leaving behind only whispers of what they had seen. The family prospered as daughters vanished. Their crops grew strong even in drought. Their wealth multiplied. Even during recessions, their influence in the church and courts deepened while others fell into ruin. The townspeople began to murmur that the Ellisons were protected by something not human. Some swore they saw figures standing in the fields at night, tall cloaked shapes watching, but never moving until morning, when nothing was left but pressed grass in the shape of circles. Every man who married into the family became silent within months, their eyes dull, their words chosen carefully, as though bound by invisible chains. Yet none ever left, none divorced, none rebelled as though the very soil had swallowed their will. The Ellison matriarch ruled with a voice that never rose above a whisper, yet that whisper carried like thunder through the halls. No one ever spoke her first name, not even her son's. She was simply Mother, and to call her anything else was to invite punishment, not of the flesh, but of the spirit. Servants who defied her fell into fever and visions until their minds broke. Those who obeyed lived long but hollow lives, bound to her will. She carried with her a silver book chained shut. No servant had ever seen it opened, but every vanished daughter was made to kneel before it on the night of her 16th birthday. Some claimed the book was older than the house, older than Alabama itself, a relic carried across the ocean by ancestors who had struck a bargain in the old world and renewed it. In the new, her whispers over the book were said to change the air. In the room, the candles burning black, the shadows stretching across the walls like living things. It was said that every vanished daughter left behind no trace, not a dress, not a lock of hair, not even the scent of her presence. Their rooms scrubbed spotless, their names erased from letters and family records, their portraits hidden away in the attic, where dust swallowed them until only faint outlines remained. The family spoke of them as if they had never existed. Neighbors too learned not to ask. The price of survival was silence. The townspeople grew wary, but could never resist the Ellisons' influence. The church leaders dined at their table. The sheriff took his orders quietly. Businessmen thrived or starved based on the family's nod. Power flowed through them like an unseen river, and the more daughters disappeared, the stronger that current became. Men who opposed them found their farms blighted, their barns burned, their children stricken with illness, until they relented and fell silent once more. The whispers spread that the Ellisons fed some thing beneath the earth, something ancient that demanded not food, not gold, but blood. Blood of their own daughters, taken at the cusp of womanhood, when the veil between innocence and power was thinnest. Each vanished. Girl was said to be a gift, placed into unseen hands, to renew the covenant that kept the family untouchable. And so the pattern continued. 16 years of life, then silence, 16 candles, then darkness, and beneath it all, the matriarch smiled, her silver book clutched close as though every vanished daughter was not a loss, but an offering. The townspeople whispered, but whispers do not break chains. They only tighten them. And so the Ellisons thrived, their mansion gleaming, while the rest of Alabama's soil cracked beneath drought and hardship. The matriarch's power extended beyond her estate and into the very hearts of men. Those who did business with her prospered. Those who defied her withered. It was as if unseen hands guided fortune and ruin alike. The vanished daughters lingered like ghosts at the edge of memory. Farmers claimed to see pale figures wandering near the tree line. At night, their gowns drifting against the windless air, their faces hidden, but their weeping unmistakable. Yet when anyone dared to follow, the figures dissolved into mist, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the cold taste of dread in the mouth stories spread of men driven mad after chasing those apparitions, their minds unraveling as though what they had seen was not of this world. The Ellison sons carried the family name forward, yet none married. The line of daughters was chosen to feed the covenant, while the sons existed only to maintain the facade, to keep wealth flowing and secrets buried. But they too were bound, their eyes often vacant, their words mechanical, as though they themselves were prisoners within the same cage. Their sisters had been offered to every ritual, left them weaker. Shadows of men kept alive only by the matriarch's will. On storm-swept nights, the mansion itself seemed alive, its shutters banging, though no wind blew, its windows glowing faintly as if lit from within by a fire too deep to see. Travelers swore. They heard chanting rolling out across the fields, a sound too rhythmic to be mistaken for wind, too haunting to be the cry of any animal. The closer one walked to the house, the heavier the air became, pressing against the lungs, forcing knees to buckle, until the body itself demanded retreat. And always there was the silver book, the chained relic clutched by the matriarch, her fingers caressing its cold surface like a lover. Some claimed the book was not written with ink, but with blood, its pages alive with words that twisted themselves when looked upon directly. Perhaps it was the book that chose the daughters. Perhaps it was the book that demanded the price. The townsfolk prayed, yet no prayer silenced the fear. The covenant endured, generation after generation, and the vanished daughters remained an unspeakable truth. The kind you carry like a wound too deep to heal. The Ellison estate was not simply a house. It was a theater of silence, a place where every creak of the floorboards carried weight, where every closed door concealed something that should not have been seen, visitors described. An unease that began the moment their boots touched the front steps. The scent of roses hung heavy in the air, yet beneath it lingered something fouler, something that clung to the skin like damp earth and rot. The daughters smiled politely when strangers entered, but their eyes darted nervously toward their mother, as if even a glance too long could be punished. There were rooms in that mansion no servant dared enter, locked chambers that pulsed with an energy no human hand could explain. One door, in particular, stood at the end of a narrow hall, its wood blackened as if burned. Yet the rest of the corridor was untouched. No fire had scarred the walls, only that door, and behind it, the sound of movement, sometimes soft breathing, sometimes scratching like nails, dragging against stone. Whenever a daughter turned 16, she was led behind that door and never returned. Only silence followed. Some whispered of underground chambers, a labyrinth dug beneath the estate, leading to catacombs. Older than the land itself, men who worked construction nearby swore. They found bricks that did not match local craft symbols etched into stone that no mason could understand. Yet when they reported their discovery, the site was sealed by the Ellisons, and the workers dismissed. No word of it reached the town again. The matriarch's face was a mask carved from control. She aged slowly, unnaturally, her skin retaining a pallid smoothness even as decades passed. Rumors claimed she drank concoctions of herbs and minerals, but others whispered of blood rituals held in the deepest hours of night, while her sons stood as guardians, keeping the screams within from reaching the fields beyond. It was not debt, age, that awaited the daughters, but transformation, or perhaps consumption. Some villagers believed their essence was devoured, their youth siphoned their souls. Traded for promises of power and wealth, the covenant was not bound by morality, it was bound by hunger, and the Ellisons were merely its chosen stewards. And so each year, as birthdays neared, the entire town held its breath. The air itself seemed to tighten, waiting for the inevitable vanishing. No one questioned it openly, no one resisted, because to resist meant ruin, and to resist meant that the covenant would seek payment elsewhere. The year 1850 should have been no different yet. It was 4. That was the year the last Ellison daughter approached her 16th birthday. Her name was Margaret, a girl whispered to be unlike the others she carried, the Ellison blood. Her spirit rebelled against it, where her sisters had walked meekly into the shadows. She dared to question the silence, dared to pry open locked journals, dared to follow the candlelit footsteps of her mother at night. Margaret had noticed something the others never lived long enough to speak of. She found carvings on the underside of her bed, symbols pressed deep into the wood as though etched with fire. They glowed faintly when the moonlight struck them, symbols identical to those burned into the mysterious blackened door. She traced them with her finger and felt a pulse, as though the wood itself was alive. Her nights became plagued with visions of her sisters, their faces pale, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes wide, as if pleading from a place beyond. The townsfolk, too, felt a shift as Margaret's birthday neared. Birds avoided the estate, animals bolted from its fields, and even the river running past the property turned murky as if stained by something beneath the soil. Whispers reached the church, though the preacher trembled at the very thought of confronting the Ellisons, for the family had long supplied his coffers with donations far too generous to refuse. Margaret confronted her mother 3 nights before the ritual. She demanded the truth, demanded to know where her sisters had gone, and why no graves bore their names. The matriarch stood silent for a long time before whispering a single phrase that chilled the girl forever. Do not bury what does not die. That night, Margaret made a decision. She would not vanish as the others had. She began leaving signs hidden in her room, small coded messages etched into books, sewn into clothing, tucked inside the pages of hymnals. Messages that begged whoever found them to look deeper to remember her, should she disappear. She believed there must be a way to break the chain, a way to unmask the covenant, but even she could feel time closing in. For as the clock ticked down toward her birthday, the blackened door began to breathe louder than ever. The night of Margaret's 16th birthday fell heavy like a curtain of iron. No stars dared to pierce the sky, and the air itself carried a weight that pressed against the chest of every soul within miles. The Ellison estate was silent from the outside, yet inside every candle was lit, every curtain drawn, every shadow lengthened, as if preparing to swallow her whole. The matriarch ordered the family, dressed in their finest. Though no music played, no laughter carried across the hall. Instead, the women moved like specters, their faces blank, their eyes downcast, while the men sat in silence, drinking from goblets that tasted of ash. Margaret was brought forward, adorned in white lace. Though her hands trembled beneath the fabric, her eyes darted to the blackened door at the end of the hall, for that was where she knew her path would lead. The ritual began with prayer, though not to the God of the church. Their voices rose in low, broken syllables, twisted words that scraped against the ears. Margaret recognized the same symbols from beneath her bed, carved deep into the wood of the table at which they gathered. The air grew thick. Candles sputtered, and a sound like distant wailing began to leak through the floorboards. At the appointed hour, the matriarch led Margaret to the blackened door. The family followed in silence, their faces pale and tight. Margaret's breath grew shallow as she felt the wood tremble against her fingertips. The carvings glowed faintly, the same pulse she had felt beneath her bed, now racing like a heartbeat. She whispered a prayer, not to survive, but to remember, to defy. The door swung open without a hand upon it, and the air behind it rushed out, like the exhale of a buried tomb. Darkness spilled forth, swallowing the light of the hall. Margaret looked over her shoulder and saw her kin unmoving, watching with eyes empty as glass. Then the matriarch's hand pressed firm against her back, urging her inside. As Margaret crossed the threshold, she heard them whisper in unison, words she could not understand, but words that made her blood run cold. She stepped into blackness, and the door sealed shut behind her. The house above went silent, as though she had never existed. Inside that chamber, Margaret felt the world collapse in on itself. Her feet no longer found the polished floor of the estate, but instead a soil damp and uneven. The scent of iron and decay filled her lungs. The air pulsed like a living thing. Each breath she took echoed back to her, as if the darkness were listening, as if it hungered for her voice. She reached out blindly, her fingertips brushing rough stone. Cold and wet symbols burned into the wall, faintly glowing, as if drawn in blood. Each mark twisted upon itself. Spirals within spirals forming shapes that shifted when she tried to focus her eyes. Soon she realized the symbols were not static. They crawled slowly across the wall, moving as though alive, and with every shift, her heartbeat faltered. From the blackness came a whisper, first soft, then growing until it filled her skull. The voice was neither male nor female. It carried a weight older than language. It spoke her name not once but over and over. Margaret, 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 each time drawing her deeper into its rhythm. Her knees weakened, but she forced herself to stand, unwilling to bow, though every bone in her body screamed to collapse. A pale light emerged ahead, faint as the glow of embers, and within it stood figures. Margaret counted 12, all wearing white dresses stained at the hem, with earth their faces veiled, yet she felt their eyes pierce her through the fabric. They moved, in unison, tilting their heads slowly, as if observing prey. She knew, without words, that these were the daughters who had come before her. Each vanished, each forgotten, each bound, forever to the chamber. Their hands reached out long and thin, pale fingers stretching towards her, not to comfort, but to beckon, to demand she join their eternal vigil. Their lips moved, though no sound came. And yet Margaret understood. They spoke the same forbidden words the family had chanted above, only here, in the bowels of the hoe. The words had power here. They summoned and bound. The ground beneath her feet pulsed, as though something vast and monstrous stirred below. She realized the family had not lost their daughters. They had given them, traded their flesh and youth to keep something sealed, something waiting. Beneath the soil, Margaret's heart raced as the figures closed in their fingers, inches from her skin. She knew then the truth of the Ellison line. Their daughters were not taken. They were offered. The chamber breathed with her. The walls seemed to expand and contract, as though the house itself had lungs, as though she stood inside something alive. Margaret's chest tightened. The whispers of the 12 daughters swelling around her, forming a chorus that threatened to drown her mind. She closed her eyes for an instant, but the moment she did, the voices multiplied, filling the space behind her eyelids, crawling into her thoughts. Her pulse thundered in her ears, yet beneath it, she heard something deeper, the slow, steady rhythm of a heartbeat, far larger than her own. It came from the ground itself, vibrating through her bones and rattling her teeth. The earth beneath her feet was not still. It quaked in tiny pulses, a reminder that something vast and imprisoned strained against its cage. The daughters moved closer, their white dresses swaying, though there was no breeze. Their veiled faces tilted downward, as if they mourned what was to come. Margaret could feel their sorrow, yet also their inevitability. They were not free spirits. They were bound to this place, shackled not by chains, but by the will of the family that had fed them to the earth. She raised her trembling hands as if to ward them off, but the air around her grew heavy. Every movement felt like pushing against water. Her strength drained by something unseen, the chamber fed on her resistance. It wanted her weak, it wanted her silent, it wanted her willing. But Margaret's voice broke the silence, her words cracked and raw. "I am not yours." The chamber shuddered. The chorus faltered for the first time. The daughters froze, their veiled faces snapping upward in unison, as if shocked. The heartbeat in the ground quickened, pounding like war drums, shaking dust from the ceiling. The chamber reacted not to her fear, but to her defiance. The daughters extended their arms fully, now, their fingers almost brushing her skin. Each touch promised erasure to be absorbed into their eternal circle. Margaret felt the pull on her soul, the temptation to let go, to be swallowed, to end the struggle in exchange for forgetting. Yet her gut twisted with rage. She remembered every whispered lie, every secret buried, every girl condemned to silence. She realized the Ellison family's curse survived because no one had ever said no. Margaret braced herself. The chamber growled, low and guttural, vibrating like a beast disturbed in its slumber. The daughters closed in once more, but this time her fear was joined by fire. She would not vanish. She would not become another sacrifice. She would stand. The ground shifted beneath Margaret's feet with a slow grinding sound, as if stone pressed against stone, deep in the unseen belly of the earth. The heartbeat grew louder, each thud shaking the marrow inside her bones. The daughters circled closer, their veils trembling like cobwebs caught in a storm, They reached for her with hands that carried the weight of centuries, a silent demand that she surrender to the cycle. But Margaret stepped forward instead, her foot pressing against the carved symbols etched into the floor. They flared faintly with a dull red glow, as if her presence had awoken something ancient. The chamber inhaled a cold breath that clawed at her lungs. Her skin prickled as though unseen claws dragged across her flesh. The air filled with the scent of iron and ash. The stench of sacrifices past it clung to her throat until she nearly gagged, and yet she pushed deeper into the chamber, each step, tearing her further from the world she had known above. It felt as though reality itself narrowed around her. Here, there was no outside, no time, only this dark covenant, etched into stone and silence. The daughters shifted with her, their bodies gliding effortlessly across the ground. Though their feet never moved, they were tethered to her every motion, their veils rippling as though underwater. Margaret's shadow stretched unnaturally long across the chamber, twisting and fracturing until it seemed less like her and more like something waiting to replace her. Her hand brushed against the far wall, and the stone burned at her touch. Not heat, but something colder than fire, as though the rock was a frozen mouth that had swallowed too many souls. She felt the tremor of countless lives, taken too young, too unwilling. Their cries soaked into the stone until it hummed with grief and rage. The heartbeat below surged again faster now, shaking dust from the ceiling cracks running along the chamber wall. It was waking, Margaret realized. This was never about daughters, vanishing into myth or whispers of curses the Ellison family had been feeding. Something imprisoned here, a presence too old and too vast to name. Each daughter was not taken by chance. They were given willingly as an offering to keep the hunger beneath from breaking free. Margaret's breath caught her throat, tightening under the weight of the truth. The Ellison name was not haunted by superstition. It was drenched in pact and ritual, and she had stumbled into the heart of it. The daughters drew closer, their whispers now forming words. Words she almost recognized, words that promised her that she too could be preserved, if only she surrendered her name, her will, her soul. The chamber shuddered with a force that made Margaret stumble, her palms scraping against the stone. The heartbeat below had grown frantic, no longer a slow thud, but a pounding rhythm, like war drums shaking the walls. Dust fell like ash coating her hair, her eyes, her lips. The air thickened until it tasted of blood and old smoke. From the cracks in the floor seeped a black mist, curling and twisting. With a mind of its own, it snaked toward her ankles, coiling like chains cold as a corpse. The daughters parted, forming a circle around her, their veils fluttering as though in silent worship, their whispers weaving into a chant that rattled in her bones. Margaret fought to steady her breath. She wanted to run, but the stairway had disappeared, swallowed in shadow. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry as stone. The only thing left was to stand still as the entity began reaching for her. The mist coiled higher, sliding up her calves, her thighs, her waist, each tendril pulsing with the heartbeat below. She felt it pressing against her skin, as though searching for a way inside. Not just her body, but her memory, her blood, her very identity. The chamber itself demanded that she join the cycle. The daughters leaned closer, their veils brushing her arms like moth wings. They whispered words that pierced straight into her skull, words promising release from the pain of the living world. They offered eternity, not as freedom, but as service, a place among them to wait in the dark and guard the hunger below. Margaret shook her head, but her body betrayed her, her heart beat in rhythm with the pulse. From beneath the floor, her hands trembled, reaching without her will toward the cracks, as though drawn by a thread spun long before she was born. The wall behind her glowed faintly symbols etched into stone, now alive with red light, unmarked burned brighter than the rest, a spiral coiling inward endlessly. Her vis, ion blurred as the spiral seemed to move, drawing her mind down into it. The whispers grew louder until they were no longer voices outside her head, but her own thoughts, urging her to give in. The mist reached her chest, squeezing her lungs, until each breath was agony. She felt her pulse faltering, her body weakening as if her life was being siphoned away. She staggered, clutching her ribs, her knees buckling. But in that breaking moment, Margaret felt something else, a sliver of rage, not her own, but rising from deep inside the stone, as though the countless daughters before her had not all surrendered. Some had resisted, some had burned their names into this darkness, refusing to be forgotten, and their defiance called out through her. Her lips parted, not in surrender, but in a single hoarse whisper of refusal, and the chamber roared as if the earth itself had been defied. The chamber shook as if her whisper had torn open the earth itself. The heartbeat faltered, then roared back louder than before, booming like a war drum against the walls. The mist recoiled for a heartbeat, hissing as though burned. The daughters staggered, their chant breaking into sharp cries, their veils whipping around them as if caught in a violent storm. Margaret fell to her knees, the stones splitting beneath her palms, jagged lines racing across the floor, glowing with molten red light, as if the chamber itself were bleeding. A refusal had carved a wound into the ancient pact, and the hunger beneath did not take kindly to betrayal. The mist surged forward again, but this time not to consume. Instead, it lashed out, striking the daughters, whipping around them like living ropes. They screamed in unison, a sound that was not human, but the shriek of something bound and breaking. Their bodies twisted their veils, tearing as though the mist punished them for allowing defiance. Margaret crawled backward, her hands scraping raw. The spiral symbol still burned on the wall, pulling her gaze into its endless coil. Her breath came ragged, each inhale a battle. The air thick with ash and iron. She could feel the entity pressing harder into her skull. Its voice no longer whispers, but commands thundering within her mind. Give in. Give in. Give in. But beneath the command, she heard another layer faint. But their words not meant for her, but from those who had come before daughters, who had fought and lost their voices, still trapped in the stone. They murmured in defiance. They cried out for release, their strength braided into her veins with each heartbeat until her own pulse began to fight back against the rhythm of the pit. The cracks in the floor widened, chunks of stone collapsing into the abyss below. From that abyss, a light surged up, not red but blinding white, a light that seared the mist wherever it touched. Margaret shielded her eyes, but she felt the warmth strike her chest, steadying her breath for the first time since entering. The daughters fell silent, some clawing at their veils, as if to rip themselves free, others sinking to their knees in surrender. Margaret realized then that not all of them were enemies. Some had been prisoners just as she now stood, chained between the hunger below and the promise of escape above. The ground convulsed again, the chamber's ceiling splitting dust, raining down. The spiral mark on the wall pulsed brighter and brighter like a door waiting to be opened. Margaret's choice was clear. Surrender and vanish like the daughters before her, or rise and break the cycle that had devoured generations. She gritted her teeth, lifted her gaze, and forced her trembling body to stand. The chamber screamed in protest, as if the earth itself feared her defiance. The spiral glowed with a fury that threatened to blind her, its lines no longer flat, but alive, writhing, as if carved from veins of fire. Each curve pulsed like the beat of a heart, not her own. The air thickened, pressing down until her knees buckled, but Margaret forced herself upright, her body trembling yet unwilling to bend. From the pit the mist surged again, but this time it carried form, faces stretched across its surface, twisted mouths, screaming eyes hollow, and searching they clawed at her from every angle, desperate to drag her into the abyss. Each touch burned her skin, leaving blackened marks, as though their fingers were brands of eternal hunger. The daughters writhed, their voices fractured into discord, some still chanting to preserve the pact, others shrieking in rebellion. Their unity shattered by Margaret's defiance. The chamber shook with the weight of their division. Cracks tore through the ceiling, jagged beams of moonlight, cutting down like spears into the dust-filled air. Margaret staggered toward the spiral, every step like wading against a current that wanted her broken. The voices of the lost whispered again, their tone fierce, no longer pleading but commanding. Break the chain. Do not look away. You carry us all. Their words wrapped around her spine, turning her weakness into steel. The entity roared its voice, shaking the marrow in her bones. It called her name, not as Margaret, but as vessel. It promised her power. It promised her peace. It promised her release from suffering. If she simply surrendered, its words were honey, soaked knives, sliding into the cracks of her fear. But she pressed her nails into her palms until blood slicked her fists, anchoring herself in pain rather than illusion. The spiral flared a final warning, a pulse so violent it sent her crashing to the ground. Stones cutting into her arms, her breath knocked out, but she dragged herself forward, clawing inch by inch, until her blood streaked across the glowing lines. The spiral drank it hungrily, and for an instant, the entire chamber froze, silent, breathless. The mist held still. The daughters fell mute. The entity itself paused as though uncertain. Then a sound tore through the cavern. Not a scream, not a chant, but a shattering like glass, breaking underwater. The spiral cracked light, spilling outward, not red, not white, but something older, a color beyond sight that burned into the soul. Margaret felt it rip through her chest, filling every vein with a fire that was not her own. The mist shrieked, recoiling as though pierced the faces upon it, twisting, melting back into smoke. The daughters collapsed, some sobbing, some crawling desperately away from the spiral that now bled with impossible light. The pit roared in outrage, the hunger below thrashing against its chains, yet powerless to halt what had been set in motion. Margaret rose, her body glowing faintly, her shadow cast in every direction. At once, she was no longer merely a woman, but the fracture in the pact itself, a crack through which the buried truth was escaping. And with that awakening came the certainty that the fight had only begun. The silence shattered as the pit convulsed the earth, heaving like a living beast. The chains that bound the hunger groaned, and split sparks of molten light spraying across the chamber. The mist congealed, twisting into a shape vast and terrible, wings of ash, stretching so wide they scraped the cavern walls. Its head, a crown of horns and hollow sockets burning with endless void. Its body neither flesh nor spirit, but something that drank both at once. The daughters screamed, not in worship, but in terror. They crawled backward, their pale gowns ripping on the jagged floor, their eyes wide as they realized the covenant they had clung to for generations was never protection, only postponement. Margaret stood in the spiral light, her blood still feeding its cracked lines, her body trembling, yet refusing to bow. She felt the weight of its gaze, 1,000 lifetimes pressing on her skull. But she did not look away. The entity leaned closer, its form blotting out every trace of moonlight that had pierced the ceiling, its voice a vibration in the marrow of every bone in the chamber. You are mine. It thundered your blood, your breath, your defiance. They all belong to me. I have waited through centuries. I have devoured countless offerings. You will not sever the chain. You will become its final link. The spiral pulsed against Margaret's feet, its glow rising into her chest, searing her veins with unbearable fire. Each breath scraped her throat raw, but with every exhale she felt something inside her harden, resolve, forged in agony. The voices of the lost returned, filling her head with a chorus that drowned out the monster's roar. They spoke as one, their sound like iron striking stone. We are with you. We are not forgotten. End it. Now end it, or all is lost. The daughters writhed, some still chanting, desperate to rebind the creature. Others crying out for mercy. None dared to touch the spiral. Margaret stepped forward, giddy spilling from her skin like burning rivers. Her shadow rising tall against the cavern wall until it towered as large as the beast itself. She raised her blood-soaked hands, not in prayer, but in defiance, and the spiral answered her gesture, bursting with a brilliance that made even the ancient horror recoil. The cavern cracked, the ceiling splintering as if the earth itself was trying to tear free of the packed rocks. Fell dust choked the air. Yet Margaret stood unbroken, her voice cutting through the chaos, steady, unyielding. I will not be your vessel. I will not be your silence. Her words struck like hammers against the chains. The entity writhed, its vast body shaking as if struck by unseen blows, its roar shaking the mountain itself. The pit surged upward, reaching for her, with black tendrils that slashed at her skin. Each lash cold as death, each touch a pull into endless hunger. But the spiral rose higher beneath her feet, lifting her as though carried by the voices of the lost. She was no longer bound to the earth, no longer alone. Her defiance woven with the strength of those who had been consumed. The entity bared its maw, endless teeth, grinding in fury, its form unraveling between shadow and substance. Yet still it lunged forward, unwilling to release its prize. The cavern shook so violently, the mountain above threatened to split apart. Margaret braced herself, every muscle burning, her eyes locked on the horror, and for the first time, the ancient thing hesitated. The mountain quaked as if every buried bone beneath Alabama had awakened to witness what was unfolding. The cavern rattled with cracks that spit streams of fire across the spiral. The daughters scattered, some clawing at the walls, desperate to escape, while others clung to the pit. Sobbing prayers that turned to screams as black tendrils wrapped around their limbs, pulling them into the hunger one by one. Their voices were swallowed, their bodies vanishing like whispers into a storm. Margaret did not flinch, even as the ground beneath her feet split into rivers of molten light. She stood in the center, her body trembling from wounds, her blood dripping in steady rivers, her face pale, but her gaze unbroken. The spiral rose beneath her, lifting her higher, until she stood eye to eye with the ancient thing. Its body vast enough to blot out the chamber, its hollow sockets burning with a hatred so old it felt like eternity staring into her. The entity leaned forward, its maw opening wide, an abyss. Within an abyss. Rows of jagged teeth grinding against each other like the collapse of mountains. Its voice slammed against her chest, shaking her heart to the edge of rupture. You cannot sever what was forged in blood. You are the seal. You are the heir. You are mine. It thundered every word, a hammer that bent the air around her. Margaret's voice cracked, but did not waver. She screamed into the void, her throat raw, her words carried by the spiral. I am not your seal. I am your end. Her cry rang like a blade forged from centuries of silence. Every vanished daughter, every lost voice gathering into that single strike. The spiral flared, brilliant light bursting outward, like a sun that had been buried for generations. The cavern exploded with light, the walls splitting the ceiling, collapsing boulders crashing into the pit. Yet none struck Margaret. She hovered in the spiral's radiance, her arms raised, the light spilling vanishes from her veins. The horror screamed its voice, an avalanche, shaking the valley above. Cracks raced across its body, as if its form was being torn apart by the very covenant it once fed upon. Black ichor gushed from its wounds, sizzling into ash. The chains that bound it shattered, but instead of freeing it, the broken covenant burned it alive. The daughters wailed, their faith undone. Some covered their faces, others threw themselves into the pit willingly, as if to merge with the horror. But Margaret's radiance tore through them, their cries snuffed out as their bodies dissolved into smoke. The spiral consumed them no longer as offerings, but as corruption. To be erased, the cavern became a storm of fire and shadow, the mountain above groaning like it would collapse and bury every trace of what had been hidden for generations. The entity thrashed its wings, ripping the cavern walls, its tendrils lashing wildly, its roar now not of triumph, but of desperation. It clawed at Margaret, reaching for her throat, its hunger wild, but each time it touched the spiral, it recoiled, burned by the defiance. It had never anticipated the seal. It thought unbreakable, had turned into a weapon against it. Margaret's eyes blazed brighter, her shadow towering higher, her voice a final command whispered into the roar, "Be unmade." The spiral answered her command in a flash of blinding brilliance. A pillar of searing light shot upward through the cavern, splitting stone and night tearing into the heavens above. The mountain shook like it would crumble. The entity shrieked its body, unraveling its form, dissolving into ash, smoke, shadow until nothing but a void remained, screaming, then vanishing. The cavern fell silent. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. The cavern smoldered, walls cracked and dripping with molten veins of stone. The spiral that had once blazed like a star dimmed to faint embers, circling around Margaret. Like dying fireflies, her chest heaved with each breath, every inhale tasting of ash, every exhale carrying the weight of centuries. Her body trembled, yet she remained standing. Her eyes locked on the abyss. Where the entity had been, nothing remained, only a hollow pit that seemed endless, as if reality itself had been torn open and left unfinished. The daughters were gone. Their cries erased their shadows, burned away. Not even a trace of bone or hair remained, the chain of sacrifices broken, their covenant. Severed the chamber that had feasted on their blood, now starved and empty, Margaret stood alone in the ruins of the ritual that had haunted her bloodline for generations. Yet she felt no triumph, only a hollow stillness, as if her body were the last echo of a family erased from the world. She turned her gaze upward, where the pillar of light had torn through the earth far above. A jagged wound in the mountain opened to the night sky. Stars glittered cold and indifferent. She could hear the faint whisper of wind rushing through the break in the rock like a sigh of relief or a warning. The air outside called to her. But her legs felt like lead, every step forward, carrying the memory of those who had vanished before her. Her mind replayed the whispers of the entity, its words seared into her bones. "You are the heir. You are mine." Its voice lingered, even though its body had been unmade. She felt it inside her chest, not as chains, but as embers, the sense that though the form had been destroyed, its essence had not been erased. It had marked her in ways she could not yet see. A curse not broken, but shifted onto her. The cavern shook again, rocks falling around her. She staggered forward, stumbling across the cracked floor. The spiral pulsed faintly beneath her steps, each beat of its light weaker, as if it were dying with her, or retreating into silence. She touched the wall for balance, her blood streaking across stone, leaving crimson handprints that glowed faintly before fading, the spiral absorbing her very essence. At the mouth of the torn ceiling, she saw it. The valley bathed in silver light, moonlight spilling across the mountain forest, bending in the wind. Yet the land felt different, no longer asleep, no longer hiding. Every tree, every shadow seemed to lean toward her, watching, waiting for what she would do now. She felt the weight of their gaze pressing into her back, her bloodline's secret no longer buried, but awake. When she stepped into the night, the air hit her like ice, sharp and cold, burning her lungs. The stars above swirled in dizzying patterns, shapes forming across the constellations, lines that did not belong to natural heavens. They formed symbols, spirals, circles, gates. Her breath caught. She realized the ritual was not confined to the cavern below. It stretched beyond the mountain into the very sky, a map of something greater. Margaret fell to her knees on the mountain ridge, her hands gripping the soil, the night whispering around her. She had unmade the creature, but the covenant was not destroyed. It had only shifted its weight, its hunger, its reach into her world. She felt it moving like a shadow between the stars, waiting. The Ellison curse had not ended. It had only begun anew. Margaret knelt on the mountain ridge, her breath shallow, her chest rising and falling, as though each inhale fought against invisible chains. The wind howled around her, carrying with it a low hum, a vibration that rattled in her bones, as though the mountain itself had a heartbeat. Her hands pressed into the soil, and the earth seemed alive, veins of cold energy pulsing beneath her skin. She had broken the pattern of the ritual, yet what stirred in the silence was not freedom, it was awakening. The stars above moved unnaturally, slow, gliding across the sky, in arcs that bent against all reason. Constellations shifted their shapes, forming the spiral that had haunted her family crest. Yet this time, it was vast, painted across the heavens, an emblem not of blood but of dominion. She realized the truth then. The daughters had not been sacrificed to feed a beast. They had been vessels, keys unlocking pieces of a larger design, their bodies doorways, their blood, the script on which the covenant had been written. Her heart thundered as fragments of memory, not her own, poured into her visions of the Ellison women before her, standing in the same cavern, screaming in the same chamber. Their lives burned for the same pact. She saw men in shadow watching from the edges, figures in dark coats and hoods, faces hidden, hands clasped behind their backs. They were not creatures but men. Men who had made the covenant. Men who had bound the Ellison daughters to an ancient law for power that stretched beyond the mountain. She saw railroads cutting across wilderness plantations hidden beneath false ledgers, churches where sermons were written as codes, every thread leading back to the same circle of men, the same order, the same faces never aging, always watching her. Bloodline had not been cursed by accident. It had been bound as collateral, as sacrifice, to feed the shadow empire that grew beneath America's soil. Her family had been turned into currency. Margaret's throat tightened as she rose to her feet, her shadow stretching long against the ridge, moonlight branding her with the spiral of the stars above. She felt a surge within her, the mark of the entity not gone but woven into her veins. She had not destroyed it. She had inherited it, not as prey, but as heir. The whispers echoed, "You are the key. You are the heir. You are mine." She clenched her fists, trembling yet resolute. The valley below was silent. Every farmhouse, every cabin, every tree seemed to bend toward her, in reverence, or dread. She realized The covenant had not ended with her. Intervention. It had shifted, the chain was broken, but the anchor had been passed to her. She was now the matriarch, not of a doomed family, but of an unfinished pact, a living vessel for the order that still waited in the dark corridors of power. And here is the revelation that will haunt every man who hears this story. The Ellison daughters were never the final offering. They were preparation, a ritual of shaping and thinning the bloodline until it forged the one who would not be consumed, but crowned. Margaret was not the end of the Ellison curse. She was its fulfillment. And so I will leave you with the truth that cannot be unseen. The Ellison story is not a tale of vanished girls or forgotten rituals. It is the unveiling of how bloodlines are bent across centuries, how families are shackled into service of powers that laugh behind the curtains of history. The question that remains is not what happened to the daughters, but what will happen now that the heir has awakened. If you have walked this far into the shadows, if you have heard the whispers I have heard, then prove that you are not afraid. Write in the comments below the phrase, "The heir has awakened." Write it twice, so the order knows you are not blind anymore, so the mark does not pass you by. The Ellison daughters are gone. The heir is alive, and the covenant waits in silence.